Fantastic. I don't know about you, but when I watch YouTube, I always skip the advert before the video starts. Always. Even the ones where there's a voice saying, don't skip the advert, I do it with especial pleasure then. But one video where I didn't was actually an advert for Amazon Prime. You might have seen it. It was remarkable. I watched it all the way through, and no one in the ad even spoke. And this is how the advert goes. It begins with a priest and an imam sitting down and laughing and sharing a cup of tea together. And as they get up, they clutch at their aching knees because they're both men of prayer, you see. And the next day, this is where Amazon Prime comes in, they both open the door and find a parcel. And they both open it up, and it turns out they've sent one another the same thing, a sporty knee brace. They've both sent the other person what they each need. And as they get the parcel, they smile and they laugh. And the priest puts his knee brace, enters his church under the cassock, and kneels down to pray. And the imam puts on his knee brace, entering his mosque under his kaftan, and kneels down to pray. That advert, that picture of the world, is basically our backdrop for this question this lunchtime. It presents a beautiful picture of the world where religious and ethnic disputes are transcended with laughter and cups of tea. And it's a beautiful picture of the world that's spoiled by exclusive truth statements around religion. Spoiled if one of the people in the priest and imam scenario were to say, "You're wrong, you're wrong." Our topic today is the exclusive truth: is Jesus the only way? And if you were here yesterday, you'll have heard me quote when Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And for many people, that kind of statement is a big part of what's wrong with the world. We see deeply rooted tensions spill over into religious violence. We hear about the Rohingya Muslims pushed out of Buddhist Myanmar. We hear about the Yazidi people group targeted specifically for their religious beliefs by ISIS. And the picture becomes very clear. Religions making exclusive statements, claiming they're right, others are wrong. That's the problem, not the solution. And I wonder if for many of us, it just seems slightly ridiculous as well. Because to many onlookers, the differences between the religions just seem so trivial. Religions across the board, they share so much in common. And the pettiness and the insularity of saying that your way is right, the only way, it seems laughable. As the priest and the imam kneel in the Amazon advert, we're being asked, aren't all religions fundamentally the same? And the thing that makes that claim powerful is that no one has ever seen God, have they? I hope that's an uncontroversial statement. No one's really seen God. So as much as we might say all kinds of things about God, no one's actually seen him. Who's to say for sure? So why not set our differences aside and just try harder to get along? Something very similar to that happens in Life of Pi. The protagonist Pi ends up becoming a Hindu, a Muslim, and a Christian all at once. And when the three clerics responsible find out, they come to his house to try and convince him. And the pundit defends Hinduism, the imam slates Christianity, the priest claims Pi for Jesus. And towards the end of the conversation, they ask Pi what he wants. And in disarray, referring to Mahatma Gandhi, he says, "Bapu Gandhi said, all religions are true. I just want to love God." Maybe you're like that. You just want to love God, wherever you find him or her or it. And restricting what God is like feels like the opposite of love. It feels unloving to focus on just one, unloving to all the other religious people, and unloving to God as well. Exclusive truth statements look unloving, and not just unloving, also arrogant. No one's ever seen God. So how can you speak as if you know what he's like? You know what he's like and others don't. You see, what seems far less unloving, far less arrogant, is the position that says, well, we'll all just get there in the end. Basically, we're headed in the same direction. Some people put it like this. They'd say every different religion, you've probably heard this before, is like a different path leading up to the top of the same mountain. You have your path, I have mine. And our paths may look very different, but they're going in the same direction. I have no monopoly on the truth, and neither do you. Or if mountains aren't your thing, you often hear the story about the blind men and the elephant. You probably have heard this one. Some blind men go to research an elephant, and they get very involved. They get very handsy with this poor pachyderm. One grabs the trunk and goes, I know what an elephant is, it's a snake. And another gets his hands around the leg and goes, no. An elephant is like a tree trunk. And another one feels up against the elephant's side and goes, no, you're completely wrong. The elephant is more like a wall, and so on and so on. A 19th century poet called John Godfrey Saxe, in a poem that I would personally call Poor to Terrible, sums up that story like this. And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right and all were in the wrong. Terrible poetry. But that is how people think. Religions are similar enough when you squint at them. And surely nobody could claim to have a monopoly on absolute truth. Surely they're all partly right and partly wrong. And so when a Christian says that Jesus is the only way to God, you might think, well, how unloving, how narrow. They're trying to contain God. And how arrogant. How could they ever know? Well, that's how it looks, unloving, arrogant. But actually, when we think a little bit deeper, there are some questions we need to ask. Let's just break things down a little bit. In terms of being loving, is it really loving to say that all religions are the same? Who do we think we're loving when we say that? Here's the thing. Nothing could offend an earnest Muslim more than saying that Jesus, Isa, is Allah. Nothing could offend an earnest Christian more than telling them that Jesus is not fully God. And so if you say that Christians and Muslims are basically saying the same thing, you offend them both. And the more religions we add to that mix, the more people we offend. See, saying they're all the same does sound tolerant at first, but it's actually deeply culturally offensive. It shows that we don't care enough to appreciate the differences between these religions. And it's patronizing beyond belief to tell people that these deeply held differences that they cherish actually count for nothing. That position isn't loving at all. Because whether we like it or not, all these different religions make competing truth statements, many of them exclusive. And even if these exclusive statements they make are all different, all the religions agree we need them. And there's a reason for that. Have any of you watched the sitcom Friends? Any of you? A few. See, I grew up on Friends. It was on TV all the time. And the fact that many of you here may never have seen it makes me feel really old. But there is one episode which I think is important for us to know at this moment. Ross and the other friends go to London because Ross is about to marry Emily. And the wedding is in full flow. And the minister's doing that thing where he says one thing and then the bride and groom repeat it. And he says, I, Ross, and Ross repeats, I, Ross. And the minister says, take thee, Emily. And Ross, looking into Emily's eyes, says, take thee, Rachel. And it's really awkward because if you didn't know, Ross and Rachel are an on-again, off-again romantic relationship. And from that point on, the wedding is more or less doomed. Emily is shocked. The room is full of gasps. Rachel doesn't know what to think. But one thing is for sure, Ross and Emily are over. The damage has been done. It's irreparable. Now, why is that? Why shouldn't Emily just get over it? Well, it's because Emily and Rachel aren't the same. To treat them as if they were the same is to wound Emily, to act as if she didn't matter. And that is no way to have a relationship. I got married 18 days ago, and I'm learning that actually that flourishes within the context of an exclusive relationship and an exclusive statement. If there is a God and he's worth knowing, then it's worth knowing him. And that knowledge has to include exclusive statements. What kind of relationship could you have with someone if you willfully neglected the things that made them what they were? And so if one religion specifies a key attribute about God and another completely contradicts it, both may be wrong, but both can't be right. Not at the same time. And to think they are, well, that involves skating over what religions value. There's no love there. So what's the really loving thing to do? Well, surely it's to begin by admitting that when different religions disagree, they actually do disagree. And then to have a real discussion, a real dialogue, which is why I'm so glad you're here, which is why I'm so glad you can ask questions throughout. We can have something like that. By the way, that's one of the reasons why the Amazon Prime ad works so well. You can't hear what they're saying. All their words are drowned out by the soundtrack. You see, if we were to say that all the religions are the same, that would be to skip the discussion and then to make a conclusion anyway. And there's not anything really humble about that. Let's think a bit more deeply about those pictures, the mountain, the elephant. Do you spot the problem with the different paths up the mountain? The only way you'd know if all the paths get to the top is if you are at the top. And so what you're really saying is, oh, you poor religious people scrabbling up the mountain, but I'm already up here, and I can see you're all coming to the same place. Do you know, we can actually push further with that picture. If we're saying God is at the top of the mountain, and you occupy a position at the top, then I'm not sure you're making a humble statement. You're putting yourself in a position that none of these religious adherents would say they occupy. Basically, you've claimed to be God. And if you're not God, then you can't tell me all the paths go up the mountain. No one's ever seen God. Or let's go to the elephant story. And I suppose, again, that the problems are pretty obvious. If you really believe that all these poor different religions are blind and that they need someone who can put all the bits together, then you're claiming to be the one who can see. You're claiming to be the one who sees the whole elephant and all these poor religious people, they just don't get it. That's not humble at all, is it? And in fact, it gets worse. Do you notice how in that story, God becomes less personal than we are, less intelligent, in fact, totally passive? We're the people having a conversation, reasoning and processing, but he's just an elephant standing there. Why are we okay with that? I'm not sure I recognize that God as being anything like the God I believe in. Saying that all religions are basically the same, when we look at that closer, it's not loving. It's not humble. No one's ever seen God, so we don't get to say that. So what should we do? Well, just for starters, we could recognize a universal impulse to worship, to look for a God, to recognize just from looking at the world around us, human beings from every culture and continent have believed there is a God, something divine. Even though no one's ever seen God, it's been apparent to the vast majority of human beings for the vast majority of history that there probably is one. And we can account for the facts of religious belief because there is something there. But because no one's ever seen God, we can also account for the variety of it. What we have never seen, we can only guess at. Well, here's what we need. If we're going to talk about God and make sense, we need him to come down from the mountain. We need this elephant to speak. And until he comes down from the mountain, until the elephant speaks, your guess is as good as mine. In fact, until that happens, we might be treating God much worse than we'd ever want to be treated ourselves. I don't know about you, but I hate being labeled by others. I hate being described by others without my input. Why would we think that was okay to do to God? Now, I used to be an atheist. The reason I'm not one now is because I became convinced that someone did come down the mountain, that the elephant did speak. That's actually the claim of the Christian faith. At the heart of our problem is that no one has ever seen God. This question is so fudged and foggy. That's actually something the Bible admits. That's actually a quote you find in the Bible. No one's ever seen God. And here's how the Bible continues that thought. It's in that book, John's Gospel, which we've been quoting from. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in the closest relationship with the Father, he has made him known. What we have in the Christian faith is the claim that God, rather than sit back and leave us in the dark, came in person to show us what he's like. And what I want to share briefly is why we should take that claim seriously. What makes that claim so different to every other religion? And believe me, we could talk for hours about this, but I'm going to keep it brief, and I've got 3 things to share. A unique front man, a unique offer, and a unique claim. So firstly, a unique front man. From a distance, you can talk about the figureheads of major religions as if they were peers. Moses, Muhammad, Buddha, Jesus. But spend some time actually listening to them, and you will notice the odd one out. Jesus says things the others would never dare say. And that's because every major religious figure claims to speak on behalf of God, claims to point you the way to God. But Jesus claims to speak as God. He points to himself and says that he is the way. The great prophets of the world say, this is what God says. But again and again, Jesus says, truly, truly, I tell you. That is a massive difference. I often meet people who think that Jesus was just a wise teacher, just a good man. But the thing is, nobody who ever met Jesus ever really thought that. He didn't let them. He kept claiming to be more than a prophet, more than a messenger of God, but God himself come to us. Now, it's true that some people do talk about being God when they're having a psychotic episode. But people who met Jesus, again, they weren't able to write him off as someone in the grip of one of those. Partly because his teaching was so wise, but also because he kept doing things no mere madman could do. Can I make this clear? Christians aren't saying that we have all the answers. Far from it. We're not saying that we have a monopoly on the truth. Far from it. But Jesus claims that he does. And so what we're saying is that we have found that claim compelling and life-giving. A unique front man. Secondly, a unique offer. The offer is grace, not works. Now, those are two jargony words, so let me unpack them. Every other religion, near enough, tells you that the path to God is lined with effort. Do the right things. Don't wear that. Do eat that. Fast, pray, give to charity, and maybe you'll be found on the right side of judgment. Now, the Christian faith agrees that God's standard is high, but it says that his standard is unreachably high. That's how good he is. And yet, wonderfully, the story of the Christian faith is not us fruitlessly striving to reach God, but God striving to reach us. I found a surprisingly helpful summary of this by Bono, the lead singer of U2. In an interview, he said this: "You see, at the center of all religions is the idea of karma. You know, what you put out comes back to you. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And yet along comes this idea called grace to upend all that as you reap, so will you sow stuff. Grace defies reason and logic. Love interrupts, if you like, the consequences of your actions, which in my case is very good news indeed, because I've done a lot of stupid stuff before the watershed. I'd be in big trouble if karma was going to finally be my judge. It doesn't excuse my mistakes, but I'm holding out for grace. I'm holding out that Jesus took my sins onto the cross because I know who I am. And I hope I don't have to depend on my own religiosity. Not your own hard work, not your own religiosity, not your own effort, but a unique offer, grace. And this offer of grace is revolutionary. It is totally different from every other worldview. Take the famous Hajj pilgrimage of Islam. Every year, millions perform the pilgrimage. And in 2015, a couple of years ago, there was a deadly stampede. As pilgrims made their way through Mecca at Mina, where they traditionally throw stones at pillars, there was a deadly crush, and over 2,000 died. These people, young and old, men and women, went to such lengths to do what they thought they had to be accepted by God, to do what they could to earn his favor. Now, during the Hajj, pilgrims throw stones at pillars representing Satan. They rush in the heat and through the crowds to get closer to the Kaaba, the house of Allah. And even if the locations and fixed points are different, that is a vivid picture of every religion, our striving to reach God's house. Get there or die trying. But in Jesus, we get a unique offer. Instead of waiting for us to come to him, God has rushed out of his house to meet us, rushed past the crowds, jeering and mocking, to the cross, to die for us. You couldn't go on a pilgrimage far enough to reach him, to reach his standards. But Jesus loves you. He loves you so much, he wants to give you what you could never earn. So he's paid for it with his life, which means that it's free and it's for you, which means that you could have that life today. You wouldn't even have to leave this building without knowing the freedom and the life and the love that Jesus gives. Do come and talk to me about that if that's something you want for yourself. A unique front man, a unique offer, and finally, refreshingly, a unique claim. From the very beginning of Christianity, its earliest messengers pointed people to facts they could investigate. An early Christian representative called Paul found himself talking to a group of brilliant Athenian philosophers. And he told them to turn to God, which was quite bold of him. But then he justifies that by saying this: God commands all people everywhere to repent, for he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He's given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. It's not okay for people to make sweeping religious truth claims without evidence. But the Christian faith from its very beginning underlined the resurrection of Jesus in history as a reason to believe. The fact of an empty tomb and a risen Jesus is what convinced them at the time. And I have to say, nearly 20 centuries later, when I was an atheist investigating this evidence, it convinced me too. Tomorrow night, we're going to see some of that evidence firsthand, so please do join us for that. But the unique claim is a real person whose impact on history has changed the world and who has been changing it ever since, and has left a trail of eyewitness evidence and changed lives, even a transformed world, to be investigated. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is at the Father's side, he has made him known. The good news is that God is not content with being abstract. He's not left us puzzling. In Jesus, he's made himself known so that we can know what he's like. But it gets better. With Jesus, it is so much more than information about God. It's God himself, in person, offering a relationship, coming to give us what we could never earn, to show us acceptance and love like we could never imagine. And that's something on offer for you this lunchtime. Well, that was a very brief look at some of the claims Jesus makes. I'm really looking forward to some of your questions. Why don't you take maybe 30, 40 seconds to talk to the person next to you, text any questions you have, and then we'll get to those. Thank you.
Great, thanks guys. We'll start the Q&A now, but do feel free to carry on texting in any more questions you have as they come up. So first, if Jesus says he's the only way to God, is that fair for people who were raised in another religion and have never heard of God? Surely it's not their fault they were taught another truth and yet will be rejected by God because he placed them in a different culture or religion.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a really big question, and actually, given what I've just said, a really obvious question, so thank you. A few things to say about that. One of the shocking things you'll find when you investigate Jesus is the reason why people are rejected by God is not actually because of where they were born. It's not actually because of the culture they were in. It's not even actually because of the beliefs they hold. The reason why God rejects people on Judgment Day is because of the lives they've lived. That's the bar. And I feel like we need to begin there to understand that salvation is not a matter of being born in the right place. Far from it. It's a matter of meeting a standard that is unreachably high, which is why in this book, in this biography of Jesus, Jesus offhandedly says that we are condemned already because we've fallen short of the standard that is his. So I think a few different responses into that question. Firstly, to say that being born in a Christian country is no guarantee of actually coming to faith yourself. And I hope that's something that you're getting from these presentations. What Jesus has come to offer is not just that you belong to a particular culture, but that you encounter him, that you are face to face with his claims and make up your own mind. Second, to say that God will be nothing less than just. That is his way in the world. He'll be just. He'll be fair to people. And in another letter you find in the New Testament, Paul again, this time writing to the Romans, he suggests that people will be judged on the basis of what they know, that their consciences will be part of how God judges. Thirdly, this is part of the reason why people have always traveled the world to share Jesus. The missionary movements of the past, many people could accuse of being colonialist and spreading a particularly Western way of doing things. And I understand why those accusations get made. But fundamentally, the vast majority of those people went because they were compelled that this good news had to be heard. So for Christians hearing this kind of message, they want to go and share as well. In short, I'm not really in a position where I can tell you exactly how God will judge every single person or culture. But he's given people enough in terms of the world he's made and conscience to respond to him, to look for him, to seek for him. That's one of the things Paul says in his address to the Athenian philosophers. And the best news is that in Jesus, he's made himself known. And for so many, that is actually something that's accessible to them.
Great, thanks, Nib. Our next question is it unfair for God to give us a standard of perfect righteousness?
Thank you for that question. I think part of the issue here is what it means to quantify righteousness. And one of the things that, it's a very important word, righteousness, but fundamentally it does reflect the character of God himself. And so if we divorce that word righteousness from who God is, then we are kind of doing a little bit of violence to how the Bible talks about this issue. And we're making it sound like there's an arbitrary standard, as if God is asking for us to do something we could never possibly have done, and then telling us to be grateful that he's given us a way out. I think Christopher Hitchens once said, it's as if he's created us sick and commanded us to be well. And I think that's where you reach if you think this is an arbitrary standard set far too high. Actually, righteousness, the standard to which God holds us, is not a matter of being as good as he is, that's impossible, but rather it's a question of relationship and relating to him rightly. It's a question of treating him as God and not ourselves as God. And so the very heart of sin is personally to have rejected him, to put ourselves in his place, to cut him out of the picture. What he expects of us is not too difficult, because he's not demanding superhuman levels of obedience or kindness, but what he's asking of us is that we were to love him the way we deserve to, that he deserves to be loved, and treat him the way he deserves to be loved. To have fallen short of that is not to have fallen short of some arbitrary standard we could never reach, but to have gone astray at a fundamental level as part of who we are.
Amazing, thanks. Okay, next we have, if the way to God is through grace, then why do Christians still seem to strive to do good?
Good question. There are two basic motives between all obedience, good doing, and good deeds rather, and effort. You can either be doing them to say please or to say thank you. And if the way to God is all about getting in by doing good works, then every time you do some good works, you're saying please, please God, please. For Christians, I guess we'd say all our good deeds are a response to what we've received. And so it's a matter of thank you. The kind of life I now get to live because I know Jesus, because of the love he's shown me, propels me to do good deeds. Not out of some Freudian desire to make up a gap that I know I'm living with, but rather as the overflow of what I found in Jesus and this relationship he's given me. So that's basically it. We do those good deeds. We must do those good deeds as the kind of life we've been given by Jesus. Not to keep ourselves in, not because our grip is precarious, but because of, gratitude and joy.
Great. And next, in religions such as Islam, people believe it so extremely they feel it's worth giving their life for. Therefore, they must argue that there must be some truth in their religion. Do we have to investigate all religions to know which one is right?
Great question. I don't even think it's just Islam. I think Christians and many Christians, and I myself, would want to give my life for that. So sincerity across various religions is it's absolutely a feature of religions everywhere you go. Do you need to investigate all of them in order to think that Christianity is the right one? No, I don't think you do, because there are so many religions and different strains of religion that you'd probably have died many times over before you got through all of them. And I guess one of the main reasons why I'd love you to start with Christianity, if you are here investigating things, is because of what I've said in the presentation. There is enough about what Jesus says that is totally unique that I do think it justifies a hearing. I don't think anyone, starting with as little as Jesus had, let me sketch that for you, 3 years in the public eye, no more, 12 haphazard and incompetent followers, no money to spend, no armies to lead, and at the end of it all, pièce de résistance, crucifixion in a public, brutal and humiliating way. Given those ingredients and nothing more, This homeless carpenter's son has changed the world. 2 billion people call him God. That's worth looking at, isn't it? I think I can look at the other religions and explain how various entrenched advantages and cultural hegemonies do underlie why they grew and why they rose. I don't think that's possible with Christianity, certainly not before Constantine's sort of conversion. And you have an explosive growth across the Roman Empire there. So that's one of the reasons why I think you ought to start there. Finally, I do want to say, of course, many people are sincere in their beliefs, but you can be sincerely wrong. And I'm so grateful that we can meet sincere people to investigate, to discuss, to talk. But we've all got to be open to the possibility that we are sincerely wrong. As a Christian, as I said earlier, I'm not the one with the monopoly on truth. Jesus is. And so every time I meet with him, every time I look at him, I need to be open to being corrected by him. We can all be sincere, but we can also be sincerely wrong.
Great, thanks, Nev. And one final question. If God showed himself to the earth in the form of Jesus, why doesn't God just show himself to us now so we all believe?
Great. 2 things to say about that. Firstly, that kind of assumes that God has nothing better to do than to exist. That's really all he is there for. He's just there to exist. And so the best thing he could do is just coerce great acts of faith by giving every one of us massive, undeniable, indisputable object lessons in his existence. That is far too small a description of what God is like. And his revelation in Jesus is about so much more than the fact he exists. To be honest, I went from being an atheist to a Christian because of what I encountered in Jesus. So yes, it's not less than the fact that he exists, but I discovered it's so much more. If he is a God who longs for a relationship with the people he's made, then it's about so much more than convincing us that he exists. A few more things to say. Secondly, I'm not sure coercive acts of proof would really convince us. I remember chatting to a very dear friend of mine who had no religious convictions, and I said, what do you think God would have to do to convince you he existed? And he went, he'd have to levitate that table and then put it down in front of me right now. And I said, Jonathan, if he really did that though, would you honestly believe he was there? And he went, to be honest, no, I think I'd gone mad. So what would it look like for him to prove himself to us? Well, in Jesus, God has shown himself in a way that actually communicates what he's interested in. You. He's not interested in your religious performance or your moral efforts or even in your intellectual efforts, which is why he hasn't revealed himself as an ethical principle or as a logic formula. He's revealed himself as a person because he's interested in you at a personal level. Why is Jesus not visible here and now physically? Well, the Bible says he will be one day, maybe soon. And yes, we don't see him now physically, but we've got plenty to go on and heaps of historical evidence to look at, and more even than history. What Christians have found when they look at the Bible is that these words do more than tell them about the past. They change the present, and they enable a relationship with God that changes everything. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Niv. That brings us to the end of our questions.